Imagine being on your way home from work, only to be surrounded by flashing red and blue lights, for no reason at all. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And trust me, you'll want to stay tuned, because this story will surely keep you on the edge of your seat. Olivia Thompson sighed as she rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling in like a heavy weight on her shoulders. It had been another long day at CodeSphere, the software company where she worked as a lead engineer. A last-minute system crash had forced her to stay hours past her shift, debugging lines of code until her eyes burned. Now, all she wanted was a cup of strong coffee before heading home. She turned into the gas station on the corner of 5th and Maple, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The place was nearly empty, save for the bored-looking cashier inside and an old sedan parked near the air pump. The neon, open 24 hours sign flickered weakly. Olivia pulled into a spot near the entrance, turned off her engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. She grabbed a styrofoam cup and started filling it at the self-serve machine. She barely noticed the store's silence, how the air felt strangely thick with tension. Reaching for her wallet, she heard the wail of sirens. At first, she paid no attention. This was the city. Sirens were just background noise. But as the sound grew louder, closer, her stomach clenched. The sirens weren't passing by. They were coming here. Before she could turn around, blinding red and blue lights flooded the store. The glare bounced off the windows, painting the walls in chaotic flashes. Then, chaos erupted. The gas station door slammed open, and a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Hands where we can see them. Step away from the counter." Olivia's heart hammered in her chest. She turned slowly, her cup of coffee still in her hand. Through the glass, she saw at least 4 police cars skidding into the lot. Uniformed officers spilled out, guns raised, their faces hardened with urgency. She barely had time to react before a heavy hand yanked her backward. The coffee cup slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor, dark liquid spreading like ink across the tiles. What's going on?" Olivia stammered, struggling to stay on her feet as she was shoved against the counter. "Shut up," one of the officers barked. "Hands behind your back." Cold metal clamped around her wrists, and panic surged through her veins. "Wait, I don't understand. I was just..." "Don't move," another officer shouted, his knee pressing into her back as he tightened the handcuffs. Olivia gasped, her face mere inches from the counter surface. Fear turned to confusion, then to something hotter, anger. "I work in tech. I was just getting coffee," she protested. "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England," one of the officers sneered. From the corner of her eye, she saw the gas station cashier standing frozen near the register, eyes wide with shock. Outside, more officers moved swiftly through the lot, sweeping flashlights over parked cars. Over the radio, she heard scattered words. "Suspect. Armed robbery. Matching description." Olivia's stomach dropped. "They think I did something." She sucked in a sharp breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Any second now, they'd realize it. But as she was dragged out of the gas station and into the cold night air, her arms locked behind her back, she saw the way the officers looked at her. Their minds were already made up. The precinct was cold, not just in temperature, but in feeling. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making you feel small, powerless. Olivia sat in a stiff metal chair, her hands still aching from the too tight handcuffs they had finally removed. A single buzzing light flickered above her, casting shadows across the dingy interrogation room. The air smelled like stale coffee and sweat. Across from her sat 2 detectives. One, a burly man with a permanent scowl, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The other, a wiry man with sharp eyes, flipped lazily through a worn notebook as if he already knew the answers to every question he was about to ask. "So," the sharp-eyed detective finally said, tapping his pen against the table, You want to tell us what you were doing at that gas station tonight? Olivia inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. I was getting coffee. The burly detective snorted. Right. Coffee. At the exact moment, the store down the street was getting held up. She blinked. Wait. What? Armed robbery, the sharp-eyed detective said coolly, watching her closely. Cashier said the suspect was a black woman in dark clothing, fleeing on foot. He gestured to her. You fit the description. Olivia stared at him, mouth slightly open. Are you serious? She shook her head, anger bubbling up. I work in tech. Why would I rob a store? The burly detective scoffed. That's what they all say. She let out a frustrated laugh, disbelief washing over her. Check the gas station cameras. Look at the footage. You'll see I was just getting coffee. Neither detective moved. They exchanged a glance. Then the sharp-eyed one leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. We'll get to that. But first, why don't you tell us where you were earlier tonight? Olivia's breath hitched. They hadn't even checked. They hadn't looked at the footage before dragging her down here, before treating her like a criminal. You didn't even verify before you arrested me, she said, voice trembling with barely restrained fury. The burly detective shrugged. Didn't need to. You were there, at the wrong time, looking real nervous. That's good enough for us. Olivia clenched her fists under the table. This was insane. I wasn't nervous until you tackled me. The sharp-eyed detective sighed, flipping open her bag on the table. He pulled out her work ID and held it up like it meant nothing. Olivia Thompson. Software engineer. Fancy title, huh? He tossed it back in. Shame it doesn't mean you're innocent. Olivia's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them see reason. But she knew how this worked. The more she fought, the guiltier she would seem in their eyes. She exhaled sharply. I want to make a phone call. The burly detective smirked, stretching his arms behind his head. Sure, he said with a chuckle, but it won't change anything. He slid the phone toward her, like it was a joke, like they thought she had no one to call who mattered. Olivia stared at it for a moment, then picked it up, her fingers steady as she dialed. She pressed the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice. Then a deep, commanding voice answered. This is the U.S. Attorney General. Who am I speaking with? The smirk disappeared from the detective's face. The phone barely rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. This is the U.S. Attorney General. Who am I speaking with? Olivia gripped the phone tighter, steadying her breath. Her voice was ice. My name is Olivia Thompson. I'm being wrongfully detained. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The burly detective, who just moments ago had been smirking, suddenly looked like he'd swallowed glass. His partner, the sharp-eyed one, stiffened, his fingers going rigid around his pen. The two exchanged a quick, panicked glance. Olivia didn't give them a second to recover. I was arrested at a gas station with no evidence, no cause. I asked for security footage. They didn't check. I asked to explain. They didn't listen. I was thrown in a car and brought here like a criminal. A slow inhale crackled through the speaker. Is that so? The Attorney General's voice had the weight of thunder, controlled but dangerous. The burly detective cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, we. He hesitated, then quickly reached over and pressed the speaker button, setting the phone down on the table as if it were burning his fingers. Sir, the sharp-eyed detective interjected, his voice now measured and cautious. There was a robbery nearby. The suspect was described as a black woman in dark clothing. Ms. Thompson happened to be at the scene. Given the urgency. The Attorney General cut him off. Given the urgency, you decided to skip due process. His voice was razor-sharp now. Did you verify her involvement before dragging her into an interrogation room? The burly detective fumbled. Well, we were about to. We're about to. Or didn't bother. The Attorney General's voice grew colder. Because as far as I can tell, You arrested my sister based on a hunch. Olivia folded her arms, watching them squirm. The shift was happening. They were unraveling. Sir, we can look into it right now. The sharp-eyed detective stammered. He shot up from his chair, scrambling for the door. I'll have someone check the footage. No need. The Attorney General's voice carried the full force of his position now. I expect my sister released immediately. And I want names. Every single officer involved in this. The burly detective's face drained of color. Sir, I don't think that's necessary. Oh, you don't? A pause. Then, I do. And if Olivia isn't walking out of there in the next 5 minutes, I will personally ensure that this precinct is investigated for misconduct. The sharp-eyed detective nodded frantically, already halfway out the door. I'll handle it right now, sir. Olivia leaned back in her chair, the steel grip of fear in her chest finally loosening. The power had shifted, and they knew it. She picked up the phone again, her voice calm, victorious. I'll see you soon. You will, her brother assured her. And so will they. The call ended. For the first time since she'd been dragged into that room, Olivia smiled. The station exploded into chaos. Within minutes of the call ending, doors swung open, phones rang off the hook, and urgent voices filled the halls. Officers scrambled as their higher-ups stormed in, their expressions a mix of anger and panic. The shift in power was unmistakable. The sharp-eyed detective returned first, now pale and visibly shaken. Behind him trailed a lieutenant with gritted teeth, his gaze locked onto Olivia with something almost like regret. The burly detective, the one who had been so smug before, stood stiffly in the corner, his arms crossed too tightly, his jaw clenched. Miss Thompson, the lieutenant started, clearing his throat. After reviewing the security footage, we see that there was, an error in your arrest. An error. Olivia's hands curled into fists beneath the table. She had been tackled, handcuffed, humiliated, labeled a criminal, and now they wanted to call it an error. She said nothing, just stared at them, letting the silence stretch. The discomfort in the room grew thick, unbearable. The burly detective shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier arrogance now replaced with nervous energy. The lieutenant swallowed hard. You're free to go. Olivia stood slowly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She didn't reach for her belongings yet. Instead, she looked at each of them, memorizing their faces. The burly detective tried to meet her eyes, but quickly looked away. The sharp-eyed detective opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it. Not one of them apologized. A moment later, another officer entered, a captain this time. Clearly someone with more authority. He spoke to the detectives in a hushed but firm voice. Olivia caught fragments of it. Suspended pending investigation. Attorney General is personally overseeing. Unacceptable misconduct. A bitter satisfaction settled in her chest. They were scrambling to contain the damage. But this wasn't about just her anymore. She grabbed her bag and turned toward the exit, her steps slow and deliberate. Each footfall echoed in the dead silence of the station. She could feel their eyes on her, watching as she walked away. No longer their suspect, just the woman who had brought their world crashing down. As she reached the front doors, she hesitated. Something made her glance back. The building looked the same. The officers inside still busy, still doing their jobs, as if nothing had happened. But Olivia knew better. She was leaving, but how many others had sat in that same metal chair, hands trembling, voices ignored? How many people had begged for someone to listen, only to be dismissed, discarded? She had been lucky. She had a phone call that changed everything. But justice shouldn't depend on luck. She pushed the doors open, stepping into the cool night air, her head held high. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Olivia's situation? Do you think justice was truly served? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story had you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Don't forget to share this video because these conversations need to be heard.